Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. So, yeah, Brexit, we're in it. All of that talking for the best part of the last 3.5 years, has come to an end. We're now in the reality of it all. I have to say it's been an incredibly interesting, yet a little bit scary social experiment from about 6 o'clock in the morning when my wife woke me up to tell me that we were leaving the EU. I have to say I've spent the next couple of hours sort of staring a bit blankly at the television, thinking we can turn this around, we can find that 2%, even though the commentators were busy telling us it was already done and dusted. I think that declares my bias. I work in VAT, I work in finance. The EU benefits, the simplifications that we had as being a member of the single market, of the customs union, were always the day job for me, very front and centre. To lose that, I had a pretty good expectation as to the kind of issues that we are encountering, that we thought we would encounter. I got my head around it at the general election. If I'm honest, I think it was very clear that the consensus of the population was that they wanted to leave the EU. I can respect democracy, whilst I don't necessarily have to agree with it. So then I think it was important that, we became part of the solution, working with businesses to help them address the challenges, be aware of the issues, and come up with approaches to kind of manage all of the above. I think if we sort of roll it forward to about October, November, that's when I really started to get frustrated. A lot of businesses were still saying, well, we don't know what the rules are, so we still can't do anything. And I reacted quite badly to that. I felt we did know what the rules were going to be. We were very definitely moving to an import-export scenario. What we didn't know was whether or not duty rates were going to apply to the goods that were moving between the UK and the EU. And October, November is a very telling timescale for me, because with a lot of the structuring that you needed to potentially put in place, you probably needed a 2 or 3 month lead-in time, when you're getting into overseas VAT registrations, contractuals, terms of sale, understanding the duty implications, other duty approvals that you need moving forward. That was the lead-in time. That was kind of the minimum lead-in time that I thought we needed. So we got our deal on the 24th of December. I deliberately took a view, given the COVID year that we've probably all had, that I was going to enjoy my Christmas break and that I would look at the terms of this deal on the 4th of January. And, I think it was then going to be interesting to see what the 4th of January looked like. So coming back after Christmas break, I did have to engage with the EU Trading Cooperation Agreement. I think it's very positive. It's a very beneficial agreement in the sense that we don't have goods on EU and UK origin manufactured goods. But I don't think that it was necessarily quite what it was sold as on the tin. Boris's comments around tariff-free trade, well, not quite, and I think then, the important point is to understand what are the limitations of that agreement. And, it's only in the last couple of weeks that, we are coming up with some quite big gaps in that trade agreement that are leading to duty scenarios that we hadn't anticipated previously. And I'll come on to some of those examples as we move through the slides. So, VAT is the centre of the known universe for me. For it to be mentioned 40 times in the trade agreement and in no real detail left me thinking, well, we need to fill in that detail. We need to understand what the obligations are going to be. And, I think very quickly it became apparent the correct emphasis has to be placed on the goods that are tariff-free. You know, it's UK origin, it's EU origin. You know, I use this concept of manufactured. Tariffs are still there in quite a large number of cases. A lot of my clients import from China, import from the US. You know, they're not subject to this trade agreement. And that's where, you know, duties can kick once, and in the worst of cases, they can kick twice. And that's where some of this UK distribution type model doesn't really work anymore. Or there are things that you need to do in order to make it work. And what I came away from that analysis was origin becomes incredibly important. Origin's always been there, but you know, when we had the big bubble of the EU membership, it wasn't such a big issue. You need to know where your goods have come from, and you need to know whether the origin changes as a result of any processing, any activities that you undertake to the goods. And I think I go a step further given the last 2 or 3 weeks and say, origin is one thing, but we also have to be clear what the preferential status of the goods is going to be. So, you know, there's a couple of bullet points in there that give you an indication as to how you acquire origin. And, you know, I think if it's manufactured in territory, from raw materials sourced in territory, clearly the goods will have origin from that country. You know, if you do enough processing to raw materials from third countries, the goods can acquire UK origin, and it's understanding at what point they cross that line from retaining their previous origin into having essentially UK origin. And I think certificates of origin are going to be part of your documentation, your audit trail moving forward. You know, you need to understand exactly what the origin is so that you can determine the duty treatments that are going to follow. So I mentioned January coming back on the 4th, and I was initially optimistic. You know, we'd had the aggravation with the ports pre-Christmas. You know, I think a lot of that was pre-Christmas stockpiling, getting goods, as much goods in the right place to try and manage the transition. The ports seemed to be moving smoothly. You know, there weren't lorry parks in Kent. There weren't big queues. And I think I mentioned the stockpiling. I think some businesses had just decided to stop sending. And, you know, we started to hear messaging that movements were getting rejected because the paperwork wasn't quite right. And, you know, there was this stat from the Road Haulage Association, 1 in 5 trucks being turned away. Freight forwarders were talking about delays. There's that bullet towards the end. This was really quite interesting for me, and it shows the kind of difference of perception. You know, you had the Road Haulage Association out there saying that January export volumes were 68% down on the previous year in January, and the UK government was very strongly denying this, saying that volumes were 90% of what they were. That's a big difference in my mind, you know, the disjoint between where the road haulage's perception is and where the government's was. And I kind of reconciled that in my own head. Is that because lorries are going back empty one way? There were some, you know, well, fairly stupid, but wholly accurate and realistic scenarios where ham and cheese sandwiches were getting taken off lorry drivers. You know, I think that sort of evidences the strict interpretation and implementation that we've been seeing from the EU, you know, which I don't think is kind of fitted into that badge of facilitating trade. You know, I think there's been a little bit of hangover emotion from the EU side about the fact that we've actually left now. Very recently, I think what's been interesting in the last week, Stena Line came out and said in the week to 22nd of Feb, Irish, so IE freight to UK, 49% lower in terms of volumes, and 102% rise from IE to FR, bypassing the UK. We're not a member of that club anymore. They're going around us rather than transporting through us. You know, and that's probably to be expected, but a bit of a shame from UK PLC perspective. Freight forwarders, initially, a number of them kind of fell over for a little bit. They couldn't cope. Their systems weren't able to facilitate the UK-EU movements. Started hearing stats, in terms of container costs, 10,000 when it used to be 1,600. EU lorry drivers referred to take UK deliveries. There was the issue with lorry drivers being stuck in Dover. They couldn't get across the channel and back for Christmas. The one that plays really badly from a supply chain perspective in my mind, freight forwarders knocking on people's doors and saying, can I have 60, 1,800 pounds, or I'm not going to deliver your goods? And that's handling charges, it's any duty or VAT. I had a colleague who bought an expensive pair of trainers from a UK website, was charged UK VAT. When the port delays all got caught up, the goods didn't arrive until the 5th of January. He was asked for another £80 on top of the 290 that he'd actually paid for the trainers. And that's when it really doesn't work for me. Customers want certainty of pricing. They don't want to be hit with unexpected, unanticipated charges in order to take possession of their goods. And then does that lead to rejected, abandoned? Burned sounds a bit extreme. But I do work with a number of clients who said, when we send goods to the EU now, if they are returned, we don't bring them back. There's no point, it costs us more than the cost of the goods. We just send them another one and they can do what they like with the old one. Handling costs, I'm quite interested in terms of what the freight forwarders are charging. The cheapest version, £3.50 per item, per package, per box, up to 2.5 times or 2.5% of the value of the goods with a minimum of €11. You have to be able to factor all of this into pricing. And does that put you out of the market? I've got clients who charge £20, £30 for certain items. If they've got to put £5 or £10 on their purchase price to manage that clearance cost, then when do they no longer become competitive? And customers could source from within the EU and not have those costs. Political tensions has resurfaced in the last day or two. The UK has decided to unilaterally extend the grace period for Northern Ireland. The EU is once again threatening us with legal action. The EU haven't covered themselves in glory in terms of triggering Article 16 themselves in terms of the COVID vaccines. And, I guess the personal view is that needs to just dial down a notch. We need to facilitate trade. We don't need to be getting into these arguments. And that Northern Ireland position is incredibly difficult to manage because you can't always please two masters. Regulatory requirement, again, it's the cheese products one for me. This client, this company, it sells cheese to Europe, and it would usually sell a barrel, £15 total cost. The new regulation requires them to get a VAT certificate in order to sell that, to send that food product, and the charges they were getting quoted for that were £180. It just doesn't work. In that scenario, they just have to stop selling. Seafood, shellfish exports, again, another very publicised issue, and all the water purification facilities on the European side, not in the UK, EU insisting that the purification is done on the UK side prior to export. Again, doesn't work. It's not something that we're in a position to facilitate at the moment. I mentioned origin, sort of right at the start, and this one's taken me a little bit of time to get my own head around, and I think the Percy Pigs is the one that's been in the press. So this is goods in Germany coming to UK and getting shipped to Ireland. If you ask me what the origin of those goods are, I'd say European, German. They come to UK, no processing, so they don't acquire UK origin, and they're pushed to Ireland, so they're going back into the EU. So duty position, UK to Ireland, you would have thought that EU origin goods, there shouldn't be any duty. But I think that's the point that we've been seeking a lot of clarification on, and the EU have clarified this. you know, they view the goods in that situation as losing their preferential status. So duty would apply going back into Ireland. And, you know, that's problematic. You know, no duty going into UK because of the free trade agreement with the EU. But when you take those goods forward, they lose their preferential status and go back into Europe, that's where there could be a duty cost going back into the EU. I've had to do that same sort of analysis with Japan. Both the UK and EU have free trade agreements with Japan. If the goods come from Japan to UK, no duties. But if you push the goods from UK into the EU, then that's where the same position arrives. The goods have lost their Japanese preferential status, and when they go into Europe, that's where there could be a duty cost based on the appropriate rate going into Europe. So it seems a little bit counterintuitive, but that's where I'm having to advise clients there could well be a duty cost here. The EU did chuck a little bit of an olive branch into the mix. They suggested could return goods relief apply. I think my personal view is it probably won't. These goods are not going back to Germany. It's not the standard returned goods relief scenario. I would be pleasantly, delightedly surprised if we had the ability to use return goods relief simply to push the goods back into the EU bloc. You know, that doesn't seem to be quite my definition of return goods relief, but I would be very pleased if the definition is broader than what I suspect it will be. Any sort of questions at that point before I sort of move into the key sorts of issues? So, I think in terms of services, the position for 1 January is in most cases relatively unchanged. So I'm not going to focus on services particularly in the rest of the presentation. If people do have questions around services, then let's pick that up in the chat box or when we get to the questions and answers at the end. The real sort of crux of Brexit is we put a really big hard border down between ourselves and Europe, and it kicks in relation to supplies of goods. Place of supply of goods is where they are at point of sale. If we're moving them cross border in an import-export scenario, then there's the customs clearance side of things, and duty comes into the mix, and who's responsible at import has been a really big challenge. And do we have the right structure, the right mechanisms in place to manage those supply chains in a tax efficient way? So unsurprisingly, the things that I'm helping clients with an awful lot at the minute is reviewing their supply chains and ensuring that they can continue to operate, that how they need to be changed, what restructuring we could do, and what's the best way to undertake their business activities with a minimum disruption to their client base, their customers. Declarations, compliance obligations need to be understood and managed. I do describe freight forwarders as the new best friend. They're typically the best place to deal with this. I worked in Big Four for just over 20 years. I asked my customs and international trade team in that organisation to do a customs clearance for me. They quoted me 6K for the privilege. I found a little old lady in Grimsby. She did it for me for £40. They have the efficiency. They're plugged into HMRC's systems, their network, and they know what they're doing. So there's a cost implication, but I think however you approach it, there'll be a cost implementation cost. You just have to decide what's the right way to do it. I think the costs of trying to do it in-house can be significantly, prohibitively more expensive if you think about team and software requirements in order to do it yourself. Contracts have been really front of mind, and I think that plays sort of seamlessly into the first of probably the 3 big issues that I'm wrestling with for clients at the moment. The one thing that we really are seeing from Europe is they're insisting on DDP terms. They don't want the aggravation factor of being involved with the importation of the goods. I'm not entirely clear in my own mind whether that's because they don't want the clearance handling costs and aggravation. Import VAT is the big red flag that I put up here. Customs duty will be a cost. In my ideal world, it would be great if an EU customer would import the goods. I'll have a conversation with them about who's going to pick up the customs duty cost. I'll have a conversation with them about who pays the clearance fees. But if I have to deal with the import VAT, I'll be honest, that leads me into the requires an EU VAT registration, and an EU VAT registration in a territory where you're going to import. I had a lot of conversations with freight forwarders, and they're telling clients you can import goods into the EU with a Dutch VAT number. And I'm going, well, you've got an EU EORI number, great, but if you import into France, how are you accounting for paying the French import VAT? Your Dutch VAT registration is not going to deal with that. So it has issues in terms of direct shipping. And with compliance on the other side, it's like, well, how do I minimize this to get it to sensible? I can manage the costs and I can still manage my logistics and my supply chains. And that's where we sort of start to look at the Netherlands and Belgium opportunities to partner with logistics organizations. And there are some good solutions both in Netherlands and Belgium, which can provide a pragmatic, sensible, single point of entry into the EU. And then it gives you the flexibility to push the goods forward from Netherlands, Belgium to your customers in up to 26 other countries. So, those are a lot of the options that we are exploring with clients. The fiscal representation point is still there. A number of the member states are coming out and saying we're not going to require that for UK businesses, but it's still a case that you need to check on a territory by territory basis. That point there about with or without legal entity is very valid as well. What sort of EU presence do you want? Is an overseas VAT registration sufficient with or without fiscal representation? Do you want to just get back into the belt and braces full version of the European club and establish a subsidiary, a legal entity there? And having done that exercise in Ireland, it's understanding what the wider obligations are. I now know that you need to appoint a resident Irish director, and you have to lease an office, which will probably cost you about €400 a month. And it's just an empty box of an office. You're not going to use it for anything. You have no activities, no presence, no employees there. But a requirement of the Irish tax authorities is that you have a business address. Following on for that, variation of the theme, EU supply chains. We used to benefit from EU triangulation. We could be in the UK and we could send goods directly from Netherlands to Germany, to France, to wherever, and we would essentially zero rate it as intra-community supplies. Bit of accounting through the VAT return and job done. That doesn't work anymore. We're not part of the EU. Our UK VAT registration doesn't facilitate that anymore. And to make that supply chain work, you have to take some sort of presence in the EU. You need to be registered. Arguably in your supplier's member state, potentially in your customer's member state. We're looking in some cases at a favourable third territory to try and get back into triangulation. And there's different sets of analysis that you need to do in each of those scenarios. But the bottom line is that the VAT has to be accounted for somewhere in the EU. And the UK doesn't facilitate that anymore. The UK VAT registration won't work. So it becomes a little bit similar to the previous slide. In my mind, that's a registration requirement. The answer is where? What's the most sensible member state for us to locate around for VAT purposes? Sales to EU private individuals, you know, this is the retail issue, I would suggest. You know, this is where you sell on a website and, you know, you would send to private individuals in other EU countries. Similarly to triangulation, the EU distance selling rules don't apply in the UK anymore. So, you know, the answer is someone's got to do an import. You know, getting the goods out of the UK is very straightforward. It's a zero-rated export of goods. But the issue then is, well, who's going to import the goods into the customer's member state? And, you know, if the boot was on the other foot and I was sat in France and you said, I've got to import goods, I would say, I haven't got a clue. I don't know how to do that. I don't want to do that. Either you do it or I can't buy from you. I don't want to buy from you. So customer experience has been really important there. You know, you have to get back to a position whereby you can ship the goods and they arrive at the customer's doorstep. And there are a number of different options, you know, that can be used to try and deal with that. But the bottom line is there's a clearance cost in there, you know, that wasn't there before. You know, so if we go back to that, to one of the first slides, you know, you've got to be able to accommodate an additional £3.50, let's say up to €11 of additional compliance cost. And does that work if you sell goods that are priced at £20 or £30? You know, the answer is probably not. You know, there isn't enough margin there to achieve it. So that's where this concept of EU hub is coming from. You know, how do I get back into the EU club? Can I send a stock of goods to that member state? Can I fulfill orders from that member state? Do I just use it as a point of entry? You know, get my goods imported in that territory and ship forward from there. And that's where those logistics providers are coming to the table and helping out with solutions that do the shipping, the transport, the customs clearance. It's frustrating because the EU is then going to implement a whole raft of measures on the 1st of July, which will significantly simplify the position. So it's a case that companies are having to come up with a plan for essentially January to July, and then from July they're going to need to have another plan to deal with July forward. And import one-stop shop, the one-stop shop are essentially the same type of measure, but the import one-stop shop is where you send the goods direct from UK to customer. The one-stop shop is where you've already imported the goods into the EU and you ship forward from the EU. Stick a little bit of online marketplace rules into there and you're starting to get a picture of the challenges that those retailers, those online businesses, you know, are having to try and manage and deal with at the minute. So, you know, how have we been helping? How have we been working with clients? For me, it's supply chains. You know, this is all about understanding your supply chains and what are the tax consequences at each leg of those supply chains. And do you have a structure or a mechanism in place that will allow you to manage it so that there aren't additional costs created? Then how can you make it better? You know, what could you do differently that would allow you to simplify, remove time, effort, resource, and reduce cost? On the import sort of side of things, I think on the whole HMRC have been pretty good. You know, I mean, I'm not disparaging of HMRC in any way, shape or form when it comes to trying to put businesses in a position to understand their UK obligations. I'm not sure I necessarily go quite that far with Northern Ireland, but with UK importation requirements, you know, the guidance has been frequent. You know, there's been a lot of communication, sometimes a bit too much. You know, in my mind, commodity codes become important. You know, previously we might have really only used them for things like Intrastat reports, but now they actually drive whether or not, you know, there's a positive rate of duty, you know, on the goods that you're importing. You know, the free trade agreement fits into that. If it's EU, you know, there shouldn't be duty, provided it's EU origin products coming from the EU. Rest of world, you know, we need to look at whether the UK has free trade agreements with the rest of world countries. I think freight forwarders very definitely have a role in terms of facilitating. I think everyone is abundantly clear they need a UK EORI number. I think in most cases HMRC are pre-registered businesses for an EORI number. It needs to be used. You know, it drives things like the postponed import VAT accounting scheme on the next slide down. Incredibly positive measure, removed the need for physical payments of import VAT. You know, so if we're talking about cash flow benefit, pretty significant. You know, I like the idea of just having to pay my import VAT through my VAT return as some notional VAT accounting entries. I think through January, it's been a bit of a mixed bag. You know, I have still seen freight forwarders requesting payments of import VAT. And my only answer for that is they haven't ticked the right box on the import declaration to say that the importer of record is going to account for the VAT using the postponed VAT accounting scheme. If we still see C79s for a period of time, okay. But, you know, I think the movement should definitely be towards the postponed VAT accounting scheme. Hopefully you're all starting to obtain those monthly statements from the CDS website. The first ones should have been issued for January. I'll be honest, I haven't actually seen one yet from a client. No one's jumping up and down and telling me they haven't been able to access them. Duty deferment accounts, wrestled with this one a little bit. Do we still need them? Import VAT being dealt with under postponed VAT accounting scheme. If there's no duty on the goods I'm importing because they're all EU origin, I've got nothing to defer. Okay. I think my personal view is that HMRC have significantly simplified the duty deferment application process. So if you don't have a duty deferment account, I'm thinking, well, it's easy to get one. I don't have to maintain bank guarantees anymore because HMRC have waived the duty guarantee, you know, that still needed to be maintained. So it doesn't cost me anything. You know, so if I can quote that at the port, if I can defer any potential liabilities I might have until the 15th day of the month following, and my goods clear quickly, you know, I can see quite a few benefits there towards having, you know, a deferment guarantee. Exports, the other side, you know, if we're selling forward, contracts, Incoterms, DAP or DDP, a lot of pressure from European customers to deliver duty paid. My personal view is to try and resist that because it gives the UK business the responsibility for import, the responsibility to pay any import VAT and duties due in that territory. And then do they have a mechanism to reclaim the import VAT? You know, to me, that's, let's say, an average of 20% across member states. You know, that's not something that can be overlooked. And I think that my only answer to that really is the VAT registration. Pricing, you know, I think is important. You know, you need to understand, particularly if you're selling over a website, you know, what's your sales price? You know, if you're facilitating import on behalf of your customer, then, you know, to me, it's selling price of goods, shipping, clearance fee, import VAT. And if you're taking that all at point of sale and the goods arrive at customer's doorstep, then you have a solution. You know, you've preserved customer experience. The tax authority has had the tax. You know, there's a little bit around what you do with returns and the likes, but that's a bigger question, you know, if we start getting into that. If you are required to register in member states, how are you managing that compliance? You know, who's going to submit a VAT return in France for you? Do you have that capability in-house? Do you need to get into bed with a tax agent? Do you require fiscal representation? Supply and install contracts have been interesting. Another EU simplification, you know, that's no longer available to us. If you supply goods and you install the goods, then the place of supply, you know, becomes that country where you perform the installation. And you know, the EU the EU and the UK position now is if it's more than a one-off, then it's a registration requirement for you. In some cases, we've got clients who are moving back to supply only, and then they're arranging for a local company to do the installation service because they don't want to cross that line into a mandatory registration requirement in that territory. So how, other than putting businesses in a position to understand those obligations, what have we been doing in terms of restructuring? On the import side, and this is with what I kind of describe as the double dip in mind. If I bring goods from China to UK and I want to send a proportion of those goods to Ireland, then I've got duties in the UK and I've got duties going into Ireland, and I need to get that back to one set of importation taxes, one set of duties. Very simple answer: send the goods straight from China to Ireland. If you still want the goods to come to UK because you have a big UK market to source, and a proportion of the goods will go forward to Ireland, but you don't know what proportion, then that's where things like IPR, inward processing relief, and customs warehousing are probably the answers. Inward processing relief in a lot of cases is a little bit simpler than warehousing. You have to be approved by HMRC to operate it. You have to get your process approved, and you have to discharge the IPR. But where you operate it properly, it suspends the import VAT and duty on arrival in UK. If you discharge it and declare and evidence the goods have left the UK, then that import VAT and duty is never payable. The goods that come into the UK, clear into free circulation and pay appropriate import VAT and duties accordingly. Warehousing, again, is the more sort of belt and braces approach. Goods going into a warehouse suspended, taxes only becoming due when removed. If goods are removed from UK, never become payable. The EU hub, is the get back into the EU VAT club. We still want to benefit from the simplifications in terms of being able to supply 26 countries. If we can do that from a single member state with a single VAT registration, that's quite compliance friendly. You can keep the costs down, but you've got logistics to think about. If you're wanting to supply into Ireland, you probably don't register in Netherlands, because if you need to send and import the goods into Netherlands to then ship them to Ireland, does that still make sense from a logistics point of view? It's important that the VAT position, the tax position, doesn't wag the dog. It needs to be that right answer in the round. And when we stick a little bit of regulatory requirements into the mix, that's where companies are taking the view it's time to set up a European subsidiary, because it gives us that real EU establishment. The bit to note there is it brings you on shore into that country for all taxes and local compliance obligations. So, I think when it comes to the solutions, it's very bespoke. It's about looking at the business, about looking at the supply chains and what needs to be achieved. And then it's tailoring a lot of the measures that we've been talking about in the last 10 or 15 minutes to the business to get the optimal answer, in terms of the logistics and the supply chain.